What do you do when your most wanted terrorist dies of old age in exile after 45 years? If you are the FBI, you call her a murderer one more time. If you are Black Lives Matter, you call her a warrior queen. And if you are watching this happen in 2025, you realize America never actually decided what Assata Shakur was. September 25th, 2025. Assata Shakur died in Havana, Cuba. She was 78 years old. The Cuban Foreign Ministry said she had passed from health conditions and advanced age. And America immediately published two different obituaries about the same woman. FBI Director Kash Patel wrote on social media that Joanne Chesimard did not fight for justice, that she murdered New Jersey State Trooper Werner Forster in cold blood, then fled to Cuba to escape accountability. He said that mourning her was spitting on the badge and the blood of every cop who gave their life in service. Black activist Thandisiswe Chimurenga, who had known Shakur's family for over 30 years, said something else. She called Assata a warrior, a queen mother, a sister comrade. She said she fought for Black people, sacrificed for them, and that her autobiography showed the beauty of a woman the state called a terrorist. The State Department released its own statement. They regretted that the Cuban dictatorship had protected this fugitive for decades and prevented her from facing justice. On social media, activist Tanisha Long wrote that Assata Shakur joined the ancestors as a free woman, that she did not die bound by the carceral system and did not pass away in a land that never respected her, that Assata taught us liberation cannot be bargained for, it must be taken. Same death. Two stories that cannot both be true. But this split did not happen because people disagree about facts. It happened because America never resolved the argument that started in 1973. And Assata Shakur's death does not close that argument. It exposes how the system actually works. So here is the question. How does someone end up on the FBI Most Wanted Terrorists list and in Black Lives Matter chants at the same time? The answer reveals who gets to decide what terrorism means when those labels get applied and whether they ever expire. Let us start with what happened when she died. The responses were not random. They followed a pattern that has been building for over 50 years. The FBI had been hunting Assata Shakur since November 2nd, 1979. That was the day she escaped from the Clinton Correctional Facility for Women in New Jersey, when members of the Black Liberation Army posed as visitors, took two guards hostage, and commandeered a prison van. She disappeared. 5 years later, she emerged in Cuba, where Fidel Castro had granted her political asylum. For decades, the pursuit stayed quiet. The FBI circulated wanted posters. They monitored her family. In 1980, FBI Director William Webster approved surveillance of her friends and relatives, including her daughter walking to school in Upper Manhattan. But the case wasn't front-page news. It was a cold case that hadn't closed. Then in May 2013, something changed. 40 years after the New Jersey Turnpike incident that got her convicted, 34 years after she escaped prison, the FBI added Assata Shakur to the Most Wanted Terrorists list. Not the fugitives list, the terrorist list. She was the first woman ever placed on it. The reward jumped to $2 million, $1 million from the FBI, and another $1 million from the New Jersey Attorney General. The timing was not accidental. May 2, 2013 was the 40th anniversary of the shootout on the New Jersey Turnpike in 1973, the day State Trooper Werner Forster was killed. The FBI held a press conference. New Jersey officials stood with them. They made it clear this was not about letting an old case fade. This was escalation. So why escalate 40 years later? Why take a woman who had been living quietly in Cuba and suddenly make her more famous than she had been in decades? The answer is what she represented, not what she had done. What she proved was possible. By 2013, Assata Shakur had been free for 34 years. Every other major figure from the Black Liberation Army was either dead or in prison. Fred Hampton had been assassinated by Chicago police in 1969. George Jackson was killed at San Quentin in 1971. Zaid Malik Shakur, who was in the car with Assata, died in the Turnpike shootout. Sundiata Acoli, who was also convicted, stayed in prison until 2022. But Assata escaped and stayed escaped. Through Reagan's presidency, through the war on drugs, through the explosion of mass incarceration that put 2.3 million Americans in prison, through the entire period when the government was supposed to be winning the war against domestic radicals. She proved you could beat the system by refusing to surrender to it, and that made her more dangerous in 2013 than she had been in 1973. ID Yours Joe 9893977D 12489069752 AOD48 1938 C15441 EFDR1CA1 Summary Type Reasoning. So, the FBI's 2013 escalation was not about catching a fugitive. It was about controlling a symbol. If you can label someone a terrorist, you can delegitimize everyone who quotes them. You can make mourning them into a political act. You can extend the punishment beyond the person to anyone who carries their message forward. And it backfired completely. Adding Assata to the most wanted terrorists list did not suppress her influence. It amplified it. Within days of the FBI announcement, activists organized Assata teach-ins across the country. They hung Assata Shakur is welcome here posters in response to FBI wanted posters. Over 5,000 people marched in New York 3 days after the terrorist designation. Black Lives Matter would later specifically reference her as a godmother to their movement. The FBI created what is called a Streisand effect. By trying to suppress her, they made more people aware of her. By calling her a terrorist, they made people ask why. And when people looked into the case, they found disputed evidence, questions about the trial, her own testimony that she had been shot with her hands in the air. They found COINTELPRO, the FBI's program to destroy Black radical movements. They found context the terrorist label was designed to erase. But the FBI did not back down. Neither did New Jersey. In 2019, on the 46th anniversary of the Turnpike incident, New Jersey Attorney General Gerber Gruwal held another press conference. He called Assata Shakur a domestic terrorist and nothing more. And then came 2015. President Obama began normalizing relations with Cuba. For the first time since the Cold War, American and Cuban officials were negotiating directly, and one of the first things American officials asked for was Assata Shakur's extradition. Cuba refused. They had granted her political asylum in 1984. They were not going to revoke it for a diplomatic deal. That refusal revealed something. Assata Shakur had become more than a fugitive. She had become leverage. A small island nation successfully defied a superpower's extradition demands by protecting one woman's asylum status. Through Barack Obama's 2 terms, through Donald Trump's first term, and through the entire diplomatic dance between the U.S. and Cuba, Assata Shakur remained untouchable. She was proof that Cuba would not bend on principles, even for economic and political benefits. Her freedom had become tied to Cuba's sovereignty. And she stayed quiet. She didn't give interviews. She didn't make public statements about Black Lives Matter, even as protesters chanted her words. She maintained security silence for decades, and that silence made her more powerful, not less. She became a symbol people could project onto, a living example that you could resist and survive. Which brings us back to September 25, 2025. She died of health conditions and advanced age, natural causes, in her home in Havana, free, 45 years after escaping prison, 41 years after Cuba granted her asylum, 12 years after being labeled a terrorist. She died having never been recaptured, never surrendered, never recanted. And the same argument that started in 1973 erupted again. Was she a cop killer who got away with murder? Or was she a revolutionary who proved you could outlast state persecution? But her death reveals something else. It's not about which label is true. It's about who decides, when they decide, and whether those decisions can ever be challenged. Look at the pattern. Assata Shakur was convicted in 1977. She escaped in 1979. For 34 years, she was a fugitive, but not a terrorist. Then in 2013, the label changed. Not because she did anything new, not because new evidence emerged, but because the political moment required a different frame. The terrorist label, once applied, never expires, even in death. FBI Director Kash Patel's statement after her death did not acknowledge that she'd been gone for 45 years. It reasserted the original frame. She murdered in cold blood. Anyone mourning her spits on cops. But if Assata Shakur was such a dangerous terrorist, why did it take 34 years to put her on the terrorist list? If she was a violent threat, why did she live quietly in Cuba for 4 decades without incident? If catching her was a priority, why did 7 presidential administrations fail? The answer is that the label terrorist does not describe what someone did. It describes what the state needs them to be in that moment. And it can be applied retroactively, selectively, and permanently. Compare Assata's trajectory to other 1970s radicals. Weather Underground members bombed government buildings. Most of them eventually surrendered. In 1980, Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dohrn turned themselves in. Most charges against them were dropped because of illegal FBI tactics during COINTELPRO. Dohrn got 3 years probation for a misdemeanor. Ayers walked free. Both became professors. Dohrn taught at Northwestern. Ayers became a distinguished professor at University of Illinois, Chicago. They got to write memoirs where they contextualized their actions, moved on. Assata Shakur never got that option. The difference was not the severity of the actions. The difference was that she escaped and stayed gone. She never asked for mercy, never negotiated surrender terms, never gave the state the satisfaction of recanting. And because she would not surrender, the state could not offer rehabilitation. The terrorist label stayed permanent because she rejected the process that would have allowed it to evolve into something else. Her death proves something. If you live long enough outside the system that labeled you, you can outlast the label's power. She died while the FBI still called her a terrorist, but she also died while movements chanted her words. Both things remain true, and the gap between them shows the label never really controlled her. Black Lives Matter did not need the FBI's permission to claim her as an ancestor. College students did not need the State Department's approval to study her autobiography. Activists did not need the terrorist designation lifted to chant her words at protests. The state's label mattered to the state. It did not determine how everyone else remembered her. And that is what makes her death relevant in 2025. We are living through another moment when the state is expanding how it defines domestic terrorism. January 6th, defendants and their supporters argue they are political prisoners. Campus protesters get labeled as supporting terrorism. Black Lives Matter activists face domestic terrorism charges in some states. The same arguments about who is a terrorist versus who is a freedom fighter are happening right now. Assata Shakur's death forces the question, When does the label expire? If 45 years is not enough time, if dying of old age in exile does not close the case, then terrorist is not a criminal charge. It is a permanent political category, and if it's permanent, then it's not about behavior, it's about power. The FBI spent 45 years hunting Assata Shakur, millions of dollars, diplomatic pressure, surveillance of her family, a $2 million bounty, and she died anyway, in her bed, free. She had inspired 2 generations of activists. She had proven that the state's definition of you only matters if you surrender to it. Her death did not resolve the argument about who she was. It proved the argument was never really about her. It was about what happens when someone refuses to accept the story the state tells about them. When someone chooses exile over confession. When someone decides that dying free matters more than being rehabilitated. America never resolved the 1970s war between the state and Black radical movements. It did not end that conflict. It simply killed or imprisoned most of the participants. Assata Shakur was the one who got away, and her death 45 years later shows that getting away was the most radical act of all. She outlived J. Edgar Hoover. She outlasted COINTELPRO. She survived the Cold War that gave her asylum. She lived long enough to be claimed by a movement that did not exist when she went to Cuba. And she died having never let the state write the final chapter of her story. So here is what her death reveals about who gets called a terrorist. The label is not really about violence. It is about whether you surrender. It is about whether you let the state control the narrative. And it is about whether you survive long enough to prove that their definition of you is not the only one that matters. Assata Shakur died, but the question of what she represented did not die with her. It is still here. And in 2025, as America argues again about who is a terrorist and who is a freedom fighter, her death proves we never actually answered that question. We simply ran out the clock.